Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Loren Richmond Jr.
All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond Jr., and I'm joined today by my guest host, co-host, Martha Tatarnic. So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Loren. It's great to be back. It's great to have this time to reflect on everything that's been going on the podcast over the last couple of months.
Yeah, so we're doing a end of season 14 and looking forward to having some conversations about what happened and some of the things that we both really enjoyed about the podcast. And I'll just give a teaser here real quick at the outset. After this episode, we actually will have a special, what I'm calling a Martha season. So 3 episodes from Martha. So we're not going to take a break for the holidays. Martha's been working hard, recording some episodes, which I'm excited to hear. So stay tuned in for our coming episodes after this.
Wow, I really like that branding, the Martha season. That's kind of exciting. And maybe we'll tease a little bit about what our listeners have to look forward to in the coming weeks. We're not in the Martha season right now. Right now, as we're recording this, we're just at the beginning of Advent, which I have to say is my absolute favorite season of the church year. It just feels like the most honest season of the church year, the now and not yet of the kingdom of God, and that preparation and sense of expectation. I just love that invitation to be attentive to where we're seeing the signposts of God around us. What's most important to you about this time of year, Loren?
You know, it's so interesting because as someone who grew up in a non-liturgical tradition, like we didn't do. My tradition, Independent Baptist, was not into Advent or the liturgical calendar at all. And yeah, I really was probably introduced to this kind of a liturgical calendar maybe 15 years ago. So in many ways, I'm still kind of learning the traditions. And I will say one thing, I've recently begun a practice trying to, like, on Sunday evenings, just with my kids and family and wife, where we do like a prayer time just to talk about the week. And, my kids are 6 and 11, so it's pretty short and sweet,
right?
To try to keep them engaged. But I did this last year. I think did this the year before, and I've just been incorporating it still, is lighting an Advent candle. As part of that on Sunday nights, which kind of lines up perfectly since we've, would have done that in the morning before, in church. So I think like you said, like you alluded to, Advent has this weird kind of now and not yet. And I think that's one thing that continues to fascinate me about the message of Jesus, is there is this paradox to it. And I think that's really made, I wouldn't say made clear, but it's made known in this season of Advent too, that paradoxical nature.
Yeah, I agree. Very much so. I think I always say that for me, like, the season of Advent is a taste. Like, we have our special foods that we eat only at this time of year. And, like, for me, food and spirituality are, like, so completely intertwined. But like, it's, to me, those, like, particular flavors of the year are just, like, so connected to that picture of what it is that God wants for us, like the joy and the delight to which, like, God is calling all of creation, that kind of wholeness, that sense of story that's, like, passed down through recipes and traditions. And like, I think as you're kind of naming that lighting of the Advent candle as being an extension of what happens in church, for me, like those meals and those special things that we make only at this time of year, that to me feels like an extension of what we do in the church year as well, in a pretty awesome way. I process life through my stomach, so that works for me.
You've been in this, I don't want to say liturgical tradition, for quite a while. Like, what keeps it fresh for you? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I have grown up basically most of my life in the Anglican Church, although I would say that the Anglican Church of my childhood was like, in Anglicanism, we talk about low and high church. So it wasn't nearly as liturgical when I was a kid as it is now. I don't remember that same kind of focus around the changing colors of the year and the changing prayers reflecting the different seasons and that kind of thing. But I think what keeps it fresh is kind of what keeps the nature's seasons fresh. Like, there's just always this invitation to see truths about our lives, like, reflected in those different moods and emotions and colors of the church year. I think it just connects to the heart in a pretty direct way.
I think that's so interesting. And again, I think there's something that's fascinated me about liturgical traditions, being somewhat new to them. Again, as someone who grew up being taught that ritual was a bad thing.
Right.
So I really kind of appreciate ritual and tradition. And obviously they don't all resonate with me, but I can appreciate what they're trying to get at.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it's always easy to interpret ritual as being stifling in some way, but it doesn't have to be.
I read a great quote on tradition, and I'm struggling to try to recollect what it was or who said it, but it was something to the extent like, tradition isn't acting out of the past. It was like living in the present, informed by the past, or something to that extent.
Yeah, I love that.
And I feel like that's something that what ritual in some ways, right, and these traditions are about.
I agree. Like, at the word traditio is, like, I think it literally means a handing down. And I like that, like, relational element that's kind of built into the word, that it's a living thing and it's a relational thing. So, Loren, the standout episode for me this season was the conversation that you had with Andrew Root. And that was a really, I think, deep unpacking of what it means to be the church in the secular age. I just found that I kept hearing all of the other episodes and then reflecting on my own ministry from the lens that Andrew Root offered in that conversation. I think, the big takeaway for me in terms of what he offered, and like, obviously he grounds his work and his writing in some really good, like, rich research. He drew a lot on the work of Karl Barth and on Charles Taylor. But I loved the reframing around, like, what the central question should be for us as a church in a secular age. And he noted that it is just so easy for the question to be about declining numbers. Like, how do we get people into our church? And, really what the question is how do we communicate the living God to a world that has a completely different framework and language around like the nature of reality and how does God speak into a secular world? I think so much of the other pieces that we talk about in this podcast, especially around like clergy wellness, around the pressures that leaders feel in kind of the hero scapegoat dualism that we sort of face in trying to like save our individual parishes, is connected to like the wrong question. It's connected to this question about how, like in the face of decline, we're the church that's left standing. We're the church that's attracting the numbers. And ultimately, like when we do that, when we kind of, and like there's a million subtle ways, I think, in all of our denominations that we just become like the metrics are around numbers, they're around givings, they're around attendance, they're around like how many people sign up for our programs, how many baptisms we're doing, like, and all of those things kind of subtly reinforce like the whole premise of like free market capitalism, which is like the secular model, right? Like we're kind of undermining ourselves at every turn when that's how we're talking about fruitfulness in ministry. And when we kind of place upon our shoulders, our leaders' shoulders, this expectation that in the face of decline, good leaders are going to be ones who buck that trend of decline. And I just thought that Andrew's work gave us permission to come back to a much more gospel-centered place of like, okay, decline numbers, like market capitalism all aside, how are we communicating the good news to a world that like we still believe needs to hear it? Like that felt like a really gracious and liberating place to center as somebody leading a church.
Yeah. Because you can speak to this more directly than I can, doing this on a full-time basis. But in that episode, right, I created that kind of like joke for him. I don't know what's like up in your neck of the woods, but in the States, especially in my area, like churches will always have like a catchy name and then like they're kind of like 3-word tagline. So I was like, well, I almost want to go so far to make like a logo for this just because it's so fun and paradoxical and simple. But I told him, like, I think like Andrew Root Church would just simply be like worship, pray, and wait.
Yeah.
And I put that in social media, and one of my clergy friends was like, that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Like if that's all I had to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Worship, pray, and wait. It's great. You've definitely shared over social media that this was a very meaningful conversation for you as well. Like, what did you find most hopeful about what he shared?
I mean, let me just say from start, you probably sensed that kind of Andrew Root theme because I read like 5 of his books in like a 6-month span.
Okay.
So I really went deep down into the Andrew Root well. And I have another book somewhere on my pile of books to read that I'm really just delayed because I'm like, okay, I've had enough. Not that I can have enough, but I need to bring in some other voices here. So that definitely did shape probably my thinking because it was I did so much reading. I think one thing, and I think I sent this to him in an email, is for me at least, his writing really gave some language to something that I was feeling.
Yeah.
And I couldn't put my finger on.
Yeah.
Like for one, I've always been someone who really loves church buildings. I don't know what it is. Like, I love church spaces, worship spaces. And in the summer even, I went and did like this little social media scavenger hunt where I found pictures of old churches from my denomination in my neck of the woods. Some of them were still in existence. Some of them were obviously closed, and kind of used a history book that someone had written in and kind of shared their stories and images of that church. And I was kind of surprised how many were like, thought it was kitschy and fun, because I was just kind of like nerding out on, you know, on wanting something to do during the summer. And I can't remember which book it is, but Andrew Root says something about churches having a resonance. And I think he kind of gets that word, I think from, if I'm going to say the name right, like Hartmann de Rosa, who's a philosopher, I want to say from Germany, I think. But I feel that, I think, like, I feel that resonance. Like, I feel like there's something more in worship spaces. And this summer, the Disciples of Christ, you know, the denomination I'm ordained in, had their national gathering, and they took a group that I was fortunate to go with, excuse me, to a little old church in Kentucky. And it's kind of like one of the two real central locations of where the Disciples of Christ kind of movement, or I should say the Stone Campbell movement for our church history nerds and our other friends who came out of that movement, where Barton Stone, hopefully I'm getting that correct, my history, there was a huge revival that took place in Kentucky. And it was at this meeting house. And, you know, this little log church is now has like I think in the 50s has like a superstructure built around it. And when I was there, we had a worship service, and I just couldn't help but like think about like looking around the logs and thinking like, you know, not even if these walls could talk, but almost like, I don't know, like the sacredness that these walls are holding, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like almost like the walls do talk, I think. Right. Like everybody here at the church where I serve, which was built in 1840, so it's old-ish.
Yeah.
They refer to this space as a thin space, like that it's just you just feel a little closer to that veil between this world and the next. And I think it has a lot to do with, like, I do think that physical spaces absorb something of what happens in them. And when you've had a community of people like praying and feeding the hungry in this space for the past, 160 odd years, like 180 years, like that, like, I think the walls kind of talk. Like, I think it gets soaked up into the physical space.
And that's why I'm so grieved whenever I hear of a church closing, not because, it being developed for housing it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing if a childcare or daycare goes in, or a community center. Like, those are all good, fine things. But to me, it's missing out.
Yeah.
And this reminds me of something I'm kind of curious your thoughts on, Martha, that I think, again, goes back to this Andrew Root theme, but I've heard in other unrelated conversations or books or podcasts, this idea of living in an enchanted world. And again, it kind of goes against that secularism. There's this, I can't remember why, I just came across something recently, and someone just made the statement like they wanted to believe, no, that's what it was, a story on NPR, National Public Radio for our American listeners. And I think they had a story about a woman who converted to Wiccanism, I want to say.
Okay.
Could be butchering the story, But there's a line that really was compelling in there, and it's something to the extent like I just got tired of like living as if there's nothing more.
Yeah.
And obviously, like for me at least, I would interpret this more as something different, I guess we would say. But I feel like, to me, that's such an interesting dynamic. I'm not sure if that's the right word in our time, about this idea, like, is this world, is this just this pure materialistic world where what we see and taste and touch is all there is?
Yeah.
Or is there this, to use a word, enchanted, mystical moreness?
Yeah. When we baptize people in our church, we have this beautiful prayer, and part of it prays that the newly baptized will have an inquiring and discerning mind, which I just love, and the courage to will and to persevere, spirit to know and to love God, and the gift of joy and wonder in all God's works. And like that inquiring and discerning mind, I think, is really important. But I also just love that we pray that people will have wonder and like awe and wonder. I think we need more invitation to feel a sense of awe, to wonder at the world around us, to not just settle for imagining that that there's just kind of one dimension of what's going on.
Yeah. I think one thing last I would want to also say is, I think, again, worship, wait, and pray, or worship, pray, and wait sounds really like, oh, we're just going to stop trying. Like, I don't think it's a stop trying. I don't think it's like a, oh, we're just going to like not care about, our preaching skills or our worship service quality. Like, we're not going to not try. It just, we're going to like realize that it's ultimately not on us.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just being really clear about our focus and our why, like why we're doing this. Yeah, absolutely. I thought that that another episode that to me felt really connected to what Andrew Root shared in that episode was the interview that you did with Gail Cafferata. And she has written a book about what it feels like to close a church. And she did a ton of research going into this book. I liked how she flipped the switch on the interview, and she ended up interviewing you about your experience of leading a church plant and needing to draw that ministry to a close. I want to say thank you, because it was a very honest and I think kind of raw conversation. And I thought that you really spoke for just so many people who have been through that experience in a way that felt really unguarded and valuable. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
I can just kind of share that I have a little bit of experience with church planting insofar as I have in two different church contexts started new congregations within the existing fabric of a parish community. And there, especially the first time that I did that, I just felt like my whole heart and soul was riding on whether or not this thing was gonna succeed. Like it felt like my child. Like it felt like it was almost hard to hear anybody like say anything critical about the enterprise because like it felt like a criticism of me. Like I really had to work through that in order to be able to not just die trying to start this thing that I loved so much. I think that I was able to attend better to my feelings the second time that I was part of starting a new worshiping community. But, you know, in both cases, I've had to go through that grieving process when things don't work out the way that I wanted them to.
Yeah.
When things come to an end, the church community that I started in the place that I served prior to St. Catherine's, like that community didn't survive my leaving. And that was a grieving process. And the church community that we've started here in St. Catherine's just hasn't come back from COVID the way that we had hoped, and is in kind of this amorphous place of, okay, what is this going to be? And is there something to salvage here? And that's not just hard for me. It's hard for all of the people who invested their hearts and souls into this vision. I mean, those are kind of the experiences around church planting, and you were speaking to your experience of church planting, but like Gail's work also details the weight that people feel in established congregations when those ministries come to a close, or when hard decisions need to be made. And I think, again, like there was so much connected in that whole conversation around Andrew Root's, like teasing out of these realities of ministering in a secular age, and the success and failure that rests on leaders to try and buck the trend. So I thought that it was just such a place of like solace and honesty for people who have been through that, who've carried that weight, who have felt the grief of things not going the way that they wanted. What were your feelings coming out of that conversation? Like what felt important to you in talking to Gail?
Yeah. And I just want to give a shout out again for her book, The Last Pastor. Yeah, I'm just looking back at the title. Really recommend it, because like this isn't just some like book where she gathered like a handful of pastors. Like she did a real full-on sociological research study as someone who has the credentials to do that. So, I mean, it's a legit study. Yeah. And I think, for one, you know, Martha, you kind of brought this up just here in our notes in our preparation for this episode, that I think this topic can really be important for someone, whether or not their church is closing. We all go through really, I shouldn't say all, but I think most of us, probably all clergy, go through a real big disappointment in ministry. And it may not always be like a church closing, but it could be a ministry or endeavor they took a big swing and a miss.
Yeah.
And like there's, I think one of the broad themes that came out that I took was like, I felt like I was alone in just like, I don't want to say hard feelings, but misunderstandings, lack of smoothness with the denomination after things ended. So for me, like it was really valuable even in that conversation when I would just say like, hey, things were kind of rough. And she's like, oh yeah, I've heard that again and again.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, like that grief can be so isolating, and that seems to me to be a big gift of the work that she did is just connecting people to one another in that shared experience. And I appreciated how you said, like, whether you've experienced a church closing or not, read the book, because it does speak to just, like, again, those pressures that we feel as people in pastoral ministry, and the success failure model that kind of we all live within.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I thought it was a really important conversation. One of the more recent episodes that you had was around the future of theological education. And you were, again, that's kind of connected to the decline of the institutional church. Like, how should theological education be adapting? This is a big topic in the circles that we all travel in, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does it look like to pay for a big, expensive seminary education? And like, when we don't have the same prospects for like lifelong full-time employment in the church when we come out of it. Like, how do we change the model? How do we change the expectations? I'm curious about your experience. That was one of the big episodes where I just felt like I wanted to jump through my earbuds and like jump into the conversation.
Yeah.
How many years ago were you in seminary, Loren?
So I think this summer will be my 10-year anniversary of an ordination. So essentially, May of 2023 was when I graduated.
May of 2013.
2013, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so I graduated in 2004. Mm-hmm. So I'll be 20
years. I graduated
years.
Bible college, fun fact.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. So I'll be 20 years out in this spring. Mm-hmm. I mean, I didn't think when I was in seminary that I was necessarily getting into a job that would provide lifelong full-time employment. I don't know. Was that an expectation that you had?
Gosh, this is such a hard question to answer, because I feel like it's hard to be, I feel like maybe this is like revisionist history, but I feel like it was to some extent.
Oh, yeah.
Like I remember, like, because I looked at a couple seminaries, and I remember, like, one of the recruiters being like, "Oh, an MDiv is that's a professional degree," and now I'm like,
yeah.
All due respect to those of us with MDivs, but I think this is in like the Josh Packard, Todd Ferguson book, where they talk about like having an MDiv is basically like saying I went to Hogwarts. Like, people don't know what to do with that.
Right? They did say that. That's funny.
So yeah, that's a hard one to answer.
Do you feel like your MDiv has served you well in the 10 years that you've been in ministry? Like, do you feel like you were educated in the things that you needed for leading churches these days? Or like what was missed? Like, what were the takeaways?
Yeah, again, I want to be kind to our sponsor here in my alma mater, Phillips Seminary, shout out. And I'm also reminded of Edwin Friedman. I think he writes this in his Generation to Generation book, this idea that clergy always say like, "Oh, I didn't get this in seminary," when really they did. Right. So I kind of want to give that give that first, to some extent. You're probably familiar, right, with the analogy of like going to seminary is like learning to become a cook or a chef, and being a pastor is kind of like running a restaurant.
Okay.
Like, I think that's a very fair analogy. Like, at some extent, like, seminary teaches you how to cook and be a chef, but learning how to run a restaurant, to stay with the metaphor, is a totally different ballgame. That being said, I know some people have advocated for like, oh, the MDiv should should be like a MBA plus some theology added on. And there's some rationale for that, but also I think theological education is very important. Like, I mean, at the least, right, we could say it like learning theology in church history is basically like what mistakes have been made in the past and how can we learn from those and not make those same mistakes, right?
Well, I think like mistakes, but I think also just like tracking the movement of the Holy Spirit, like being clear that that those cycles of death and resurrection are part of the life of the church, that that actually like survival of the institution isn't sort of our job. I think that there's a lot to be gained from being a student of church history, for sure, in terms of encouraging us in this time and place. Like, we have a lot of privileges of being the church today that we shouldn't lose track of.
Any thoughts for you on that? You know, you've been out 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, I think I have a bit of a different take on it than a lot of my colleagues do. I think I hear a lot of my colleagues say exactly that. Like, I should have taken courses in human resources. I should have taken courses in finances. I should have taken courses in how to run a business. Like that, kind of all of those practical pieces of running, say, $1 million institution, like hit or miss in terms of whether or not we have the skill set or any of the experience to be able to do that when we find ourselves in these situations. But at the same time, I actually do feel like pretty well served by, like, in our seminary, the model was that you take a certain number of biblical courses, theology courses, pastoral courses, and church history courses. And guess what? Like, I wouldn't want to be serving in ministry without that foundation. Like that, it seems to me that sort of the other pieces, either A, you learn as you go, or B, like maybe you do need to equip the body of Christ and the different gifts within it, rather than just like, I'm never going to be a property manager. You know, I'm never going to be the person that you should turn to in terms of knowing like what needs to happen with the plumbing in the building. And like, I could use that skill set in ministry for sure, but I'm really glad to draw on other people in the body of Christ who have that skill set. So to some degree, I feel like some of the things that we get cranky about with our theological education, like, doesn't really recognize that the pastor shouldn't be the be all and end all of every need of the organization. But at the same time, I do think that there's a big financial question, no doubt. Like, if we see fewer and fewer full-time, lifelong ministry opportunities in front of us in the future, then, you know, what does it look like to equip theological education? So I don't have all the answers, but good to be carving out the space for the questions, because they're definitely serious questions.
And to bring this back to our topic from the beginning, Andrew Root does come to mind at all, because I feel like he would, his thinking is something like the same thing, that it's not supposed to be all on the management skills, you know, the human resources, the business savvy, the pastor. Like, there is some element of waiting for God to move, and trusting God as hard as that is today, right?
Yeah.
With those external pressures.
Yeah.
I would also say, you know, you're giving me an opportunity to tease here. Trying to find the book here in my stack. Hopefully going to have on Ted Smith. He writes a book, The End of Theological Education.
Oh, okay.
So I'm hoping to have that conversation in the next season. Do you want to take a minute to tease your season here?
Yeah, the season of Martha. Well,
that's actually season 2, Martha. This is Martha's season. Your summer will be season of Martha.
Okay. Fair enough. Actually, so I just finished an interview that I guess will be out sometime in the next few weeks with Justin Anthony, who comes to us from over the pond. And he has a really interesting book. Now, it came out 10 years ago. It's called You're the Messiah and I Should Know Why Leadership is a Myth and Probably a Heresy. So if that's not a clickbait title, I don't know what is. And he wrote this 10 years ago, but he was kind of saying like nobody cared about it 10 years ago. But now that we're sort of seeing the fruits of investing so heavily in this idea of like MBA priests and like you need a business degree to manage the life of the church. And like we're kind of in the throes of that in a lot of ways in the church these days. As again, we like throw a lot of noodles at the wall and try to see what sticks in saving the institution. He really like takes to task sort of a lot of the assumptions that we have around managerialism and leadership in general. And he draws on a lot of research from the secular world in terms of how we talk about leadership and then how we've like maybe adopted that into the life of the church without a lot of critical thought. So I think that'll challenge me a lot because I talk about leadership in the church constantly. And, his book really causes you to pause and think like, oh, like what is the definition of leadership anyway? And is that the best language for talking about pastoral ministry? So that's a bit of a tease. And, I'll also tease because I think that it's very relevant to Andrew Root's work as well. I got to interview Michael Graham, who co-wrote the book, The Great Dechurching. And that really draws on some very current research around why people are leaving the church, the institutional church. And spoiler alert, the conclusions that they draw are not like the conclusions that you might think. So
very, very good. Very good tease there. I'm intrigued.
Yeah. It's going to be a fun couple of episodes ahead. I also got to talk to Amy Frickholm, who is an editor with the Christian Century. So that's a bit of a different voice too, in terms of how journalism and that carving out of space for the inquiring and discerning mind in the life of the church is important too for us. So I've enjoyed the conversations and hope that our listeners will too. So here's another theme that keeps coming up for me in the Future Christian podcast sphere. And I've said this a lot over the course of our conversations together, Loren, but I just think that one of the great things that this podcast does is it makes space for a diversity of voices across our Christian church in terms of assumptions, ways of teaching, especially ways of talking about spiritual experiences that form us as Christians. I grew up in a very mainline progressive experience of the Christian church. And Loren, you grew up in, for lack of a better word, an evangelical expression of the church. I think that it's valuable in these recap podcasts to share a little bit across our experiences of those two different contexts to continue to foster more understanding and more common ground across our different Christian cultural contexts. I just know that in the context I grew up in, there was such distrust toward people in a more fundamentalist or evangelical expression of the church. And I think that distrust works both ways. So I think breaking down that distrust is a pretty important thing these days. So I thought it would be interesting today for each of us to answer, what's something in your Christian upbringing that you have held close, and what's something that you've left behind?
I love this question. I'm so glad you brought it. I almost want to include it in our end of questions, that we ask everybody now. So I think something that comes to mind is, one is, I still really hold a deep reverence and appreciation for the Bible. In my work, in my quote unquote secular day job work bag, I have a Bible that I carry around. And whenever I go on a trip, I always like to bring a Bible. I have a Bible in my car. So I think that's one thing that comes to mind for sure. I will say, for about 8 years, I left behind prayer.
Wow. Yeah.
And I've recently re-engaged prayer a lot. I think one thing that I really have thankfully left behind is I think the guilt, and I don't say that I don't feel guilty about things. But I've gotten a little better, at least I'll say this, about trying to be true to what I believe and what I think rather than the external pressure of others, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really good.
How about you?
I think that something that I hold close is that permission for intellectual curiosity that I grew up with in the church, that I just have such tremendous gratitude for. And I just don't believe I would know how to be a follower of Jesus if I hadn't understood that permission to be there. I'm just so grateful that there was never a sense that, you can only ask certain things or believe certain things or wonder about certain things.
Yeah.
I loved the intellectual freedom of the church that I grew up in. And then I would say something that I have left behind or expanded might be a better word. Growing up in a liturgical tradition where the prayers tend to be ancient and beautiful. And there just isn't free form prayer built into our services.
Right.
Or very little of it.
Yeah.
I remember the first time that as a seminary student, I had to pray with somebody in a hospital room. I was so scared because I'd never done such a thing. I'd never prayed out loud without a book, with other people. And I have such love for our liturgy and for those beautiful ancient prayers. But I'm also just so grateful to have my world expanded enough that I can pray out loud with just whatever words happen to be in my mind and on my heart in that moment. And it doesn't have to be perfect or beautiful or even that coherent. It can just be honest. I'm happy for that.
I love that. Thanks for sharing that. That's a great one. I'm reminded of, this will actually be somewhat of a tease too. Hopefully going to have on Liz Coolidge Jenkins, who's a pastor and writer, and she has a little section in her book about her experience in evangelical church and so much of prayer being that off the cuff thing and coming to a mainline tradition where it was prepared prayers and kind of noting the good, both sides of each practice. So that's fun. Thanks for sharing that.
Thanks, Loren.
Well, Martha has this great idea that I want to give her credit for, of an engagement session in our episodes like these, are mid and end of the season wrap-ups. So if you have a question or comment from something you've heard on this podcast, I want to invite you, Martha and I want to invite you to send your questions to an email, my email, Loren, Loren, at resonatemediapro.com. We'll have a mailbag segment in our upcoming recap episode. So again, Loren at resonatemediapro.com. And looking forward to engaging more with some of our listeners. So thanks again to Martha for this idea. And Martha, as we always do, we will leave one another with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Peace be with you as well, Loren.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Loren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.